So good morning, everybody. I'm really glad to have you join the assessment of IESO's Pathways to Decarbonization study from the perspective of municipal climate action plans. Really glad to have Yul and Ralph here from SSG. This report has actually been in the works for some time. And I wanted to give a little bit of the history associated with this report and the goal associated with it. But before we go into that, I am going to do a little bit of a land acknowledgements and share a little video. I've been having a lot of fun actually finding new videos in terms of Indigenous sharings. So there's a number of different things that I was thinking as we're advancing our plans for the summer vacations and things that we want to do over the summer. I thought here's a really good opportunity to share some different ways that we could advance our Indigenous knowledge, our support for Indigenous communities through our planning of our summer vacations and what we can do. So I'm going to share one video just while we're letting everybody in. Give me 1 second. And I'm admitting all these folks at the same time. Oh, wait, sorry. You know what I have to do? Sorry. Give me 1 second. I need to exit full screen. I may not have actually shared my audio. So give me 1 second. I'm going to stop the sharing. I must have forgotten to do that because I always forget to do that. And yes, I did. Okay, let's try this again.
My name is Serene Fox, artist and ambassador for the Tread Right Foundation. At Tread Right, we believe that every land we touch has a story, and that travel is a vital tool for education, compassion, and for communities to be heard. I'm walking on the shores of the Ottawa River in the capital of Canada. My people call this place Odawa. It was a place of trade for hundreds of Indigenous nations and is currently unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory. My ancestors, the original travelers, met here and paddled up this river to exchange necessities like hides, tools, food, and clothing, like moccasins, the traditional footwear of Indigenous people in my homelands, and we still wear them today. I'm meeting with Roberta Anderson, a Cree elder who lives here in Ottawa. She's an incredible artist who makes moccasins and teaches at the Manitoba Mukluk Storyboot School, a project that shares the art of mukluk making with students from across the globe, and a longtime partner of the Tread Right Foundation.
I know you as a moccasin and mukluk maker, but that's not what you started with, so.
No, I started with the beadwork.
How did you fall in love with making moccasins and mukluks?
When somebody would buy one and they would look at it and they couldn't get over the fact that I made it, and I was saying, I made that.
You made shoes.
Yeah.
You love teaching?
Oh, I love teaching.
What do you love about it?
Just all the people that I teach and then watching them, how excited they get.
Why is it important for you to teach your own kids, your own family, your granddaughters, grandkids?
It actually makes me really proud. Way after I'm gone, I want them to know that this is what I did for a living, and I want them to know how to do it. That way they can show their kids.
It's important that we keep our traditions and our culture alive, but also indigenizing the new modern times that we're going into. You know, even through our own moccasins, these tell so many stories about where we've been. And the tops are always very beautiful, these different vamps that are on here. They tell us a lot of stories about our own people. My moccasins were gifted to me, and I wear those when I dance, and they offer me healing, and they protect my feet when I'm dancing. you can always tell the stories from the bottoms. Because on the bottoms, if they look like that, that means they've been worn very well.
It's who we are. It's what we represent.
Roberta is working to keep her culture alive so our communities can stay connected to their traditions. I encourage travelers to seek the truth about the lands they visit and engage with genuine experiences that respect and nurture the cultures that exist there. Try to find the history of the place you call home. Perhaps there's a story that's been erased or a thriving culture pulsing just under the surface.
Thanks so much for indulging me on that one. And if I can do one more plug, I am just going to do a little plug that if you are looking for places to go on your vacation or planning some things, there's this really great park called Chiefswood Parks right on the Six Nations on the Grand River, and a really great place to kind of go visit. They run a series of workshops but you can also just do the kayaking and enjoying that time period. And they have great cabins as well. So if you are looking for a summer vacation plan, you might want to check out Chiefswood Parks, and I'll put all of that information in the chat function as well. So thank you so much. I wanted to also give a little bit of background in terms of the rationale and goals for the report. Let me just make sure that all of the folks are in. Yes. Okay. So really what we wanted to do is really understand the strengths and weaknesses of the IESO pathways to decarbonization. This started previously with this effort started when the IESO put out their first decarbonization study that was and it was really we were struggling to try to understand the assumptions, the methodologies that went into it. And there was a lack of transparency to truly understand what was going on here. What was the IESO considering? What wasn't it considering? And the CAC, the Clean Air Council, put in a submission to the IESO to advance a conversation on that. And the IESO kind of indicated that they were working on a pathways to decarbonization study, which would help kind of answer some of the questions that the Clean Air Council provided to the IESO that they were looking to seek information on. Then as part, when that pathways, the Clean Air Council also indicated to the IESO that it desired to do a peer review of the IESO pathways to decarbonization study. And for that reason, there was a real strong desire and a request on the IESO's part to increase the transparency and methodology that was used in there. That was part of the goal. I will admit, based on the level of transparency that we were able to get in the report, we weren't able to do a peer review in the sense of actually recreating the numbers that the IESO had in their report. But the goal on this is really to understand the IESO's modeling and municipal climate action plan modeling, and where are they aligned and where are they misaligned, and how do they come up with such different results, and how do we address that, and how do we advance the conversation moving forward? Now, I was joking with Yul and Ralph before everybody joined on the call today and saying that, you know, one of the key things that when anybody kind of starts a sentence with me saying we need to talk, I usually am the first one to say like, oh, I'm out of here. But there is no doubt about it. We need to talk about energy in Ontario, and we need to talk about energy all over Canada, but we really need to advance a lot of these discussions in Ontario to do what is right on our energy systems and our climate change commitments moving forward. We all need to do a better job of working together. And part of the goal of this report is to better equip municipalities to engage in conversations with their utilities, with the IESO, with the ministry, with the Ontario Energy Board, a little bit better. Totally understand that this is a very intimidating process. There's a lot of experts that have been using a lot of jargon. We're probably getting a little bit of a taste of our own medicine on that effort because of all the jargon that we use normally in the climate change space. But I really wanted to kind of say the goal of this is to better enable all the players who are needed in this conversation to engage with each other in a much more wholesome and fulsome way, so that we can really address the issues and what we need to do as a province to move forward on that. All right, on to that little spiel I gave. I'm going to stop my sharing. And I'm going to turn it over to Yul and Ralph to do a summary of the report. Now, we did share I shared the report because we wanted to try and be as provide as much information as possible. Totally know that you may not have been able to have a chance to review the report. It is a lengthier document, and that's why we wanted to do a summary. But then after the presentation, we will be going into some discussions. We will be using Menti. I'll be asking people for input on some of the recommendations, outreach efforts, and then we're going to dig into a little bit more of a conversation moving forward. In the meantime, I'm going to turn it over to Yul and Ralph, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabby, and it's very much a pleasure to be here. We have been digging into the Pathways to Decarbonization study and reflecting on its implications for municipalities and municipal climate action plans for a couple months, or it feels like a couple months. Maybe it actually hasn't been that long. And I think it's important to acknowledge that this study is really an important first step in beginning to understand what it will take to decarbonize the electricity system in Ontario. Developing a pathway like this is a very complex undertaking, and you're dealing with a future which is inherently uncertain, inherently unknowable, and you're dealing with the complexities of ensuring that everyone has access to electricity to the extent that they need it going forward. So there's a lot of complexity in sorting through all of that. And we've prepared the following comments with appreciation for those efforts and really an acknowledgement of how much work is represented by trying to sort through all of those different details and dynamics. So just to give you a little more background on us, so Sustainability Solutions Group is a workers' cooperative. We've been active in the climate action planning space in Canada and the US and more recently in Chile for 20 years. We have about 40 people who are dedicated to climate action planning, primarily with municipalities. And we've worked on more than 100 of these plans. So it is our bread and butter, but more importantly, it's also our passion. And in our work, we've primarily worked with communities, municipalities, but we've also been working more recently with utility regulators and also some states on exactly the kind of questions that are brought forward with this study. So I think that makes us very well positioned to provide some commentary on this report for you. That said, there are limitations, like Gabby mentioned. We aren't privy to all of the assumptions or details that are contained within the modeling that underpins the study. So there may be clarifications that would help further refine some of the comments that we will share with you today. So with that, I will pass it over to Ralph to take the first few slides.
Thank you, Yul. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending where you are. I'm going to start by just summarizing very, very briefly the Pathways to Decarbonization report that was published by the IESO a few months ago. Basically, the report included a couple of scenarios. One, it was examining the possibility and the feasibility of a moratorium on new natural gas generation on the system and beyond what's already committed. And the second part of the study's scope was to look at what a decarbonization scenario could look like for Ontario by the year 2050. And it's that second part that has really been the focus of our review and analysis and of our comments today. Excuse me. The basic method is classic electricity forecasting style. It started with the annual outlook that was published in late 2022 for the future demand for electricity based on the load forecast. That outlook, it did include some additional electrification, but only to the extent that it reflected policies or laws that have been passed. So for example, the Toronto Green Building Standard was incorporated in the outlook, and so was the federal government's electric vehicle mandate. So to the extent that those two measures result in increased electricity share in space heating and transportation, those were already in the outlook. The outlook and the forecast embedded in it, that is sort of the jumping off point. That's the base camp, if you like, for the decarbonization scenarios, which were then constructed using that outlook as a point of departure. And essentially, they laid on top of that outlook very high levels of electrification of space heat, including retrofitting of the existing residential stock, very high levels of electrification in the transportation sector, increased electrification in the industrial sector, strong growth in agricultural sector, and so on. So very, very heavy assumptions of electricity taking a larger share of heat and transportation and use markets. The result being that the electricity consumption in the demand scenario that underpins the decarbonization study results in a doubling of electricity consumption in this province by mid-century, growing from its level now of a little under 150 terawatt hours to roughly 300 terawatt hours by 2050. In other words, adding more demand to the system in the next 20 to 23 years than has been developed over the last roughly 120 years since the system began to be constructed. Same thing is reflected in the capacity of the system, or even more so, growing from 42 gigawatts in 2022 to 88 gigawatts in 2050, requiring therefore the construction of 69 gigawatts of new capacity. So this is an enormous projection of growth in our electricity infrastructure in the province. There are a number of no regret measures that are identified, basically things that the IESO recommends should be done while we're still talking about and discussing the scenarios, including accelerating measures for non-emitting capacity, starting the planning process for new nuclear, long duration storage, hydroelectric facilities. There's a massive build out of the transmission system in the decarbonization scenario, including several hundred new transformer stations to shore up the ability of the system to deliver all of this new electricity into the municipal distribution systems around the province. So this is an historic outlook to the extent that one would take it as a serious suggestion. The investment that would be required to build this future, somewhere in the range of $400 billion between now and 2050. Roughly, to give you a sense of how much money that is, for those of you who are not comfortable with billion-dollar figures, that's pretty close to 20% of the entire GDP of Canada in a single year. It's a very significant amount of capital investment for the province to be able to come up with, and that ought to be a concern for capital markets as well as economic planners in considering the feasibility of the future, which is described in the IESO report. What we did then, and I'll just leave it at that. This is in terms of a summary of the report. And the next couple of slides, we just talk a little bit about the perspective that Yul and I brought to taking a look at this report. We were trying to look at it through the lens of local action planning for climate change, a field in which both SSG and myself have been quite involved for quite a long time, 20 or 30 years, where we have been witnessing the mobilization of resources at the local government level in Ontario focused on the climate emergency, where we are seeing quite serious efforts by local governments, including dedication of finances and staff resources to developing strategies for addressing the climate emergency, which necessarily brings in the question of how does one decarbonize one's community. But the basic perspective that's driving that activity is the climate emergency. In contrast, the perspective that one sees reflected in the IESO report is one of an incremental, which is not to say small, but an adjustment to the central focus of electricity commodity planning, which is the IESO's mandate and which has characterized its activity since its inception. Before them, the Ontario Power Authority, and before them, Ontario Hydro, where they don't have a mandate to decarbonize. And so when they are asked to show what a decarbonized electricity system would look like, the technique and the perspective that comes to it is one of reducing carbon emissions as a constraint on the central planning exercise. And I use the word constraint advisedly, and those of you who are familiar with optimization techniques and the methodology that characterizes electricity system planning in Ontario will know what the implications are of treating carbon reductions as a constraint. In the next slide, a little bit more on the scope that flows from these two different perspectives. In the case of the local climate action plans, it's a very, very comprehensive approach that looks at the whole community as a system that gives rise to the demand for fuels and electricity. And beneath that gives rise to the demand for energy services like heat and mobility. And within that scope looks at all of the possibilities that local governments can use their direct and indirect influence to move the system in the direction of decarbonization. And the electricity commodity system is a part of that picture, but it's only a part of that picture. And it's integrated with that larger system in ways that are quite important when one is trying to look for a sustainable long-term decarbonization of a community. And you'll see some of that in the later slides. A much narrower scope, of course, in the IESO mandate or the IESO method. It's essentially the demand for electricity, while not purely exogenous as it used to be in these types of electric power planning reports, is still essentially a starting point variable. It's not looked at in any sort of a deep way at all. The extent to which it is assessed for its potential to contribute decarbonization is generally restricted to the technological possibilities for improving the efficiency of electricity using devices, a much narrower question than how one can move the larger community system towards lower levels of carbonization through a much broader application of the principle of efficiency in the development of energy services and how they're provided for. In the next slide, we then look at the way that one approaches mitigation opportunities given these different perspectives and these different scopes. And here again, following the same kind of polarization, I hate to use that word, or bifurcation of approaches that we see here. Within the municipal action plans, we see an integrated approach to energy efficiency. Even land use itself and transportation planning are regarded as fair game for studying possibilities for decarbonization of the system. Again, whereas in the electricity system planning methodology world, it's really a much more narrowly technologically focused approach on mitigation opportunities, restricted mainly to existing and even some future technologies that are not really quite commercially proven yet, but technologies that are essentially focused on the efficiency of electricity using devices and the technologies for generating electricity. The next slide basically talks about the outcome of these two different approaches. And we're going to have more to say about this as we summarize our work. But when we look at these climate action plans, when you take this integrated system bottom-up approach, the demand for electricity in the future, or the level of consumption for electricity in the future, does grow. And how could it not when we're talking about electrifying transportation and electrifying space heat? But it doesn't grow by nearly as much as it does when you look at the outputs of this other way of approaching thinking about the future of the electricity system, which is reflected in the decarbonization report, where we see, as we've already mentioned, the system growing at rates of 2 or 3% per year from now out to the year 2050, resulting in a doubling, as opposed to maybe a 30% increase if you look at the bottom-up municipal action planning approach. So this is a wide gulf in outcomes that emerges between these two different bodies of work: the municipal climate action plans on the one hand, with their bottom-up wide scope approach, and the IESO top-down narrowly and electricity commodity focus, resulting in a projection or a scenario with much, much larger growth rates of the electricity commodity system. In the next slide, we move on to the question of engagement, and I'm going to turn it back over to Yul at this point.
Thanks, Raul. So I think that the contrast here is really that the IESO engagement process is indeed extensive and does talk to many, many people. I think there's more than 300 submissions with respect to this particular study. But that's a very different process than the engagement process, which is used to develop a typical municipal climate action plan, which involves engagement with community members in terms of identifying their vision and opportunities, and multiple touch points within the context of a local community, and then ultimately approval by a council who doesn't really have a lot of understanding or familiarity with energy systems, or at least typically does not. So it's very much a participatory, democratic process to arrive at a climate action plan and agree upon a climate action plan for a municipality, which is, I think, in contrast to the approach that IESO brings. So I think there's a lot of legitimacy and strength into the climate action plans and the vision that they represent at the community scale. So that foundation is not really represented within the PDS. And I think it's important to note that municipalities have a long, long history with the electricity system in particular, and indeed with the energy system in Ontario. I think one can attribute the existence of the electricity system, at least in part, to work undertaken by municipalities going back in history. And then subsequently, municipalities have really shaped the demand for electricity going forward. And in particular, in the past 5 years, or even maybe a bit longer for some municipalities, they're very engaged in energy systems, in particular how it relates to climate action. And this is a highlight or illustration of some of the climate action plans that we've been involved in Ontario, and many others exist as well. And these are typically major investments for the municipalities, and plans that shaping the direction of land use planning, of investments, of infrastructure for the community. So municipalities are deeply, deeply involved in shaping and directing the future of energy. But that perspective is really not incorporated in IESO's vision. So you really do get this parallel universe at play, where IESO is taking demand as a sort of an input, and municipalities are starting to shape demand, but there's no interaction between those two. And I think some of these climate action plans, one can argue that they're optimistic in terms of achieving the deep emissions reductions that science indicates is required. But I think on the other side, it's also equally, one can make the same argument about IESO's projections. And certainly the municipalities would be much more likely to achieve their emissions reductions if IESO was working hand in hand with actually empowering municipalities in different ways to achieve their targets. Then if there is no coordination, it becomes much, much harder to achieve the targets the municipalities have set forward. So just to Ralph mentioned that the 1% projection. So to get to that, what we did is took this selection of municipalities with which we worked on and modeling that we've done for those municipalities, and basically summed up electricity in 2016, 2018, or 2017, 2018, and then summed up the total in 2050. And this is a consumption basis. So this is not about peak demand, which was not analyzed within most of these studies. And we saw, I think I should note that these are really bottom-up, highly detailed, calibrated models for the energy system for each of these municipalities. So they're, I think, much higher level of detail than IESO would be able to get to within its models. And then also the growth forecasts are also very finely tuned to the specific circumstances of each municipality, for industry, for commercial buildings, for residential buildings. So it's much higher level of resolution and understanding of the energy system than it would ever be possible for IESO to get to because of the narrower geographic focus. But when you sum all of these up and the vision that these municipalities have for 2050, you see differentiated levels of growth depending on what's going on in the particular context. Like, for example, Hamilton is projected to experience much higher levels of growth as the steel industry electrifies than, for example, other municipalities, or depending on the amount of future development that's projected to occur. But when you sum it all up for this selection of municipalities, which represents a significant chunk of the population of Ontario, you're at about 1% per year, which is what Ralph indicated. And there's a bunch of reasons for why it's only 1% of growth. And I think those reasons are really important for IESO to understand and really to assess. And so just before I go to there, I'll pass it back to Ralph just to talk about a little bit more about past projections of growth that have happened in the Ontario context.
Yeah, this is just a very brief historical interlude from someone who's been engaged on and off in this topic now for 45 years and remembers previous arguments or discussions in Ontario over the future demand for electricity. When I first got involved in 1976, Ontario Hydro was projecting that by 1997, there would be a 38,000 megawatt gap between supply and demand in Ontario unless the province built and had in service an additional 24 nuclear reactors and 18 coal-fired generators, all post-Arlington, all to be online by the early 2000s. The expansion plan was based on a forecast system peak of 57 gigawatts by 1997. And the lower demand on the uncertainty band was 36 gigawatts by 1997. And Hydro stated right in the report that it's very unlikely the actual load would be outside the range of these scenarios. The actual demand in 1997 was 22.2 gigawatts. None of those 42 additional nuclear and coal stations were ever built. A Royal Commission was established actually at the time that projection came out, the Portland Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning, by the Conservative government of the day, who were, I think, alarmed more by the capital requirements of Hydro's projected plan than they were by the other dimensions of it. But there was widespread concern across the province at the time by those who, among those who concerned themselves about the electricity system, including municipalities, that somehow the electricity planning function in Ontario had gone off the rails and had lost touch with reality, hence the Royal Commission. 10 years later or so, 15 years later, in 1989, Hydro produced a new long-range plan driven by a long-range forecast that defined a large gap between the system's capacity and the projected future needs. That gap was going to open up in the mid-1990s, reaching 9.7 gigawatts by 2005 and 21 gigawatts by 2014. Hydro once again tabled a plan for several new nuclear and coal-fired generating facilities. An environmental assessment got underway. Hydro asserted there was only a 10% chance the actual load would ever fall beyond a lower bound forecast of 28.7 gigawatts by 2004 and 33.5 gigawatts by 2014. Actual demand, we now know, peaked in 2004 in this province at 25 gigawatts, 10 gigawatts below the median forecast and 3.7 gigawatts below even the lower bound of the forecast bandwidth. That plan was withdrawn by Ontario Hydro the facilities, none of them were ever built. The environmental assessment that had commenced to assess that plan was canceled. And we went another 15 years before in 2005, plans for additional gas power plants were expedited because of a gap that existed between the system's capacity and a forecast demand that would grow to 163 terawatt hours by 2010 and 177 terawatt hours by 2020. In event, electricity demand in Ontario reached an all-time peak in 2005, and the gap never materialized. I just dwelled on this a little bit because I know that it's tempting to say, well, of course, the system is going to have to grow like crazy to accommodate electric vehicles and electrification of space heat. But let's take a deeper look. Given the history of the electricity planning authorities in this province to consistently overestimate the future requirements on the supply side because of an inability to properly define and analyze the demand side, there's good reason why we should be skeptical about claims that the system now must double. And furthermore, when those of us who have been involved in some of these bottom-up plans take a look at what's possible, we find that because of the age of our commercial building stock, there are enormous opportunities to electrify gas-heated buildings without increasing, and in fact, in some cases, decreasing electricity consumption. There is an enormous potential to improve the efficiency of the system with electrification that seems to be missed in the projections that we're seeing from the IESO. We can't tell because the level of detail that is published and made available in the IESO's plan is very, very low. So it's difficult to know why it is that they're coming up with such extremely high levels of system growth compared to the 1% per year that we're seeing from these bottom-up plans. But we need to understand that gap. And by we, I mean those of us whose futures are going to be affected by the type of system that we start to invest in and build. And so, end of historical interlude, but I just wanted to make the case that we have been here, at least I have been here 3 or 4 times before now, where what seemed to be an obvious projection of very high rates of growth in the system for one reason or another in the past. And in the past, the electricity planning officials were just as confident in their forecasts as they are now. Reality took a different turn. And it was always because there were changes going on in the broader system that lies outside the scope of the IESO planning method that were undermining the projected demands for electricity. Now, maybe it's more than 1%, but it's almost certainly less than 2 or 3%. And we need to get that right, or we are in danger of making a real mess of this with an awful lot of malinvestment. And also, it could undermine what the municipalities are trying to do in responding to climate change. Back to you, Yoel.
Thanks, Ralph. And just to build on that, I think the question is, well, how do you actually gain efficiencies within the system while you're electrifying and decarbonizing at the same time? And this is 2 charts from City of Toronto's net zero by 2040 strategy. On the left, you have businesses planned. On the right, you have the net zero scenario that we've modeled from a bottom-up perspective. And you can see electricity is the yellow and blue is the natural gas. You can see natural gas being phased out just after 2035. And also you see gasoline being phased out. And it's notable that the overall energy system, and I think this is a really important finding, and not only for the electricity system, but also for the energy system in general, because it has implications for costs and so on. But in general, the total energy consumption goes down significantly. Electricity also goes down. And you wonder, well, how could that possibly happen? So part of that is a lot of behind the meter solar generation in particular. So that reduces demand on the electricity grid. That is not in the IESO analysis. Another part of that is, as Ralph described, a lot of the new technologies which are coming on board, or not even necessarily new, like electric vehicles and heat pumps, are significantly more efficient than their incumbents. And so there is an existing pool of electricity consumption in the system today that the efficiency gains within that system can support additional electrification of new efficient systems without growing that system. So it's really about drawing down that reservoir in order to create space to electrify new systems. And that can be within industry, within commercial buildings, within residential buildings. But a critical piece of that is deep building retrofits. And that's really what enables or prevents the need for significant growth in the electricity system. And those building retrofits appear expensive if you analyze them on their own, but the benefit that they deliver to the energy system as a whole is really the value that they bring, in addition to all sorts of co-benefits around energy poverty and so on. But they reduce the need for additional capacity, additional distribution changes, additional transmission, and allow the space to electrify heating, future and existing heating loads and transportation. And so that's really what you see in this picture of Toronto in the past, or in the business plan scenario and in a net zero scenario. And I think that's the kind of analysis that it's really difficult for IESO to get at because of the narrower focus on electricity. So another piece that we noted, and I'm just highlighting some interesting findings in our review of the PDS at this point. So by 2050, IESO projects approximately 27% renewable energy, so wind and solar, within the electricity system. We looked at a few other leading studies in different jurisdictions, one for the UK, a recent report by the Climate Change Commission, and then also one from the National Renewable Energy Laboratories in the US. And both of those are exceeding 60% wind and solar by 2035. So this is 15 years earlier than 2050 for IESO. So this gets, I think, to one of our key questions, is why were not higher levels of renewable generation included in, at least as an alternative scenario or a different scenario within the IESO study. The level of wind and solar seems extremely low in this study compared to what others are evaluating in similar studies. Another note that we had is that, that we noticed, is that the financial analysis was very narrow in terms of its scope. It really just looked at system costs. And this is drawing from a study, again, the National Renewable Energy Laboratories in the US. And not only do they look at the systems costs, which is the blue number on this chart, but they look at the avoided social climate change damage using the social cost of carbon, and they also look at the health benefits. And it's when you combine those two that you really get a compelling financial outcome for the investments. But that type of analysis was not included within the IESO study. So again, like the critique that's been leveled against the recent Parliamentary Budget Officer's report last week, I believe, it doesn't include the avoided costs or the avoided damages from climate change or the avoided health benefits. And those are really the reason that we're doing this work in the first place. So to not include those seems like you're missing a key part of the story. So those are some observations. There's many more, of course, in the report, but we will give you a quick overview on some recommendations that we've identified. And there are 11 of them, so I'll take you through these pretty quickly. So the first is really more scenarios. We are involved in scenario planning, have been involved in many similar projects, analyzing different scenarios for organizations. And you always need at least one reference scenario, if not two. But in this analysis, there is only one decarbonization scenario. And so it comes with, as Ralph mentioned, a hefty price tag. But what does business as usual look like? What happens if the pathway to decarbonization scenario is not implemented? And we can't tell that. Maybe it's 500 billion, or maybe it's 200 billion, or it's really uncertain. So we need at least one reference, if not more reference scenarios, to accommodate different possible future trajectories. And then, of course, it would be fascinating to explore other possible futures for the electricity system. Like, what happens if demand doesn't grow so much? What happens if there's much more emphasis on demand side measures? What happens if there's greater penetration of renewables? So all of those possible futures are not evaluated in the study, and understanding the implications of each of those from a cost perspective, from avoided climate damages, et cetera, I think is critical to knowing and deciding on what kind of future the electricity system should have in Ontario. I'll pass it over to Ralph for the next two.
Yeah, I'll be very quick with these, Yul. Second recommendation is that this needs to be an integrated energy system analysis. I've already made the case for this in my earlier remarks, but we really need to have electricity system planning, which is embedded in a fuller system-wide understanding of where the demand for the consumption of electricity is coming from, and the forces that are working to increase that, as well as the forces that are working to moderate that. And we don't get a sense from what little we can see from the IESO report analysis that that kind of perspective is reflected so far in the work that they're producing. In the next recommendation, number 3, it's possible that the IESO mandate needs to be changed. It's not well aligned with stated government commitments to respond to the climate emergency. It's difficult to ask the IESO in some ways, or perhaps it's a lot to expect an organization with as narrow a mandate as the IESO to take on a problem like responding to climate change, and expect them to be able to do that in a way that takes the broader approach to it that is necessary for finding the best solutions. So we've included in our list of recommendations a review of the mandate of the IESO to see whether it isn't time to modernize it and align it with where we're at in the 21st century and what we need from our electricity system and our energy system more generally. Back to you, Yul.
Thanks, Ralph. So regional disaggregation is another key element. I think from the perspective of municipalities and their economic development strategies, and also their climate action plans, understanding the implications of demand side measures or any of these scenarios on their particular region, or even better on their municipal boundary is really critical to understand. So having that spatial component to these projections would really ground truth the future scenarios and also allow for alignment or at least understanding of divergence. The report doesn't account, or the scenario doesn't account for the impacts of climate change. And we see in our work that has a significant impact on energy demand as heating degree days are projected to decrease, and cooling degree days are projected to increase. So that could be plus or minus 30% on electricity demand and consumption. And so embedding projections of how particular thermal loads will change as a result of climate change is a key element of the analysis that needs to be understood. Ralph, do you want to speak to transparency? You've already touched on it.
I think I've already laid the groundwork for why one might expect this recommendation to be in our list. The level of transparency that characterizes the IESO work is way too low for what's necessary to have an open public discussion about the future of our energy and electricity systems. I tried to, in a simple exercise, see if I could reproduce their very high demand rates, and even making what seemed to me to be unrealistic assumptions, heat pumps that were not very efficient, buildings that didn't have any thermal efficiency upgrades, commercial building HVAC equipment that got replaced with HVAC equipment that is just as inefficient as the equipment being replaced, which is like 40 and 50 years old, a lack of modern control systems in commercial buildings, and so on and so forth. I still could not come close to the numbers that are in the IESO report. And I don't know why, because I can't see into their assumptions and their results with any level of detail at all. I do know that this sudden and rapid growth in the forecast demand for electricity, which is projected not only in the decarbonization study, but in the underlying outlook from which it is based, doesn't seem to be materializing so far. The last time I checked a week or so ago, electricity consumption in Ontario this year is actually running a little bit behind where it was last year at this time, even though we are supposedly into this steep curve that characterizes the forecast electricity demand, both in the outlook and even more so in the decarbonization. So we've got to get this out in the open so that we can come to an understanding, first of all, and then decide on the best course of action.
Thank you. The economic analysis I spoke to, but it's very critical to include both costs and benefits. Particular social cost of carbon is a really useful tool, and then also avoided health costs, which we see is becoming more and more standard in this type of analysis. Risk analysis. So the report does speak to the impact of the federal regulations, in particular with new gas capacity. But there is a gap there, and I think that combined with the rapid projections of demand really create the risk of stranded assets, and that's, I think, goes back to the point of having multiple scenarios, is really understanding what the risks of stranded assets are and how those might impact electricity prices. And also there's a competition for capital because a lot of the 300 or 400 billion could equally be directed to demand side measures, which may actually deliver a whole set of compound benefits that exceed and also solve the same problem at the same time. So is there a better place to take that capital and put it and place it with respect to addressing the climate emergency than investing it all in an electricity system that we may not actually need? So understanding that risk and using sensitivity analysis and other techniques to evaluate it, I think, is a really critical component. The GHG accounting, so most municipalities use the GHG protocol for accounting for emissions and making sure that the IESO's analysis syncs up with that so that those two pieces can be easily compared, and also IESO's forecasts can be embedded within future projections for municipalities. The implications of the PDS scenario for distribution are obviously very significant. And that is something that is a foremost consideration for municipalities. In the inverse, the projections and climate action plans that municipalities have developed have a very different vision of what distribution could look like, or there's a vision that is implied. And so ensuring that vision is also reflected in the IESO scenarios is critical. So this is a much more distributed, localized electricity system than the centralized model to which IESO is accustomed of considering. And then the last piece is really empowering and supporting the detailed and very thoughtful climate action plans that municipalities have invested so much time and effort and money into, so that IESO can take advantage of and support through policies and incentives and otherwise those visions, because those visions really solve, I think, a lot of the challenges that IESO projects in the scenario that they have put forward. So that is it from us. Of course, there's more details in the report, and I expect that we will, as more and more discussion around this occurs, we will find out more and be able to refine or clarify some of our insights and analysis. Ralph, do you have anything you want to add? Sorry, Gabby.
Oh, go ahead. Ralph, do you have anything you
Not
want to
me,
add?
no.
No? Okay.
No, I think I've said more than enough.
Well, thank you so much, Yul and Ralph. I really appreciate this. Actually, one of the first things that happened when I was reading this report, when you came back with it, was like, well, it kind of explains so much in the misalignment that you see between municipal climate action plans and provincial electrification scenarios, and and it really did help to explain a lot. So based on that, we are going to go we have 35 minutes to dig into gathering a little bit of input from all the people on the call. We really wanted, this is about a collective conversation that we all need to have. But in order to do that, we all need to build up our energy electricity system literacy to engage in a really useful forward-thinking conversation. And this report is starting to is one of the efforts trying to advance that energy electricity system literacy, empower municipal staff and council members to better understand how they need to and how they can engage in this energy conversation that we need to have across the province. So I did throw the www.menti.com along with that, and I am going to I want to try and advance a little bit of a conversation on this. So give me I'm going to be sharing my screen. Okay. And I want to bring this in and I want to start presenting this. Oh, sorry. Sorry, just excuse me. I'm going to stop that. I wasn't on the right slide. Oops. All of these. Sorry. It's coming. It's just being a little slow. Very slow. Why does it keep going to that? Okay, so based on this, some of the key takeaways on this one, we really wanted to kind of get a little bit of a sense of like what value or what was the top learnings that you got coming out of reading the report or sharing this presentation. So we just wanted to kind of highlight on that because it's really something, it's really important for us to understand what people are getting or receiving as a result of the information, because that's something that really did kind of highlight to me. My first reaction when I read the report did kind of speak to me. The one key question that came up in my brain is like, why are we so willing to pay so much more for supply than we are willing to pay to reduce demand on electricity? Why is it because we have a traditional direction that way, which is very true? That has been our kind of the thinking thus far on the electricity system, is focusing in on the supply side as opposed to really investing in reducing on the demand side. And the main reason I think for that is like there's always there's a lot more energy efficiency opportunities available to us now that we should be considering. The electricity system of the past, which is big generation, big transmission, one-way flow of electrons, isn't going to be the electricity system of the future if based on where the world is going, and we want to make sure Ontario keeps pace with that. All right, so thank you very much for providing that. So we really wanted to kind of get some information on the recommendations. So just while I'm putting in them, this is going to be highlighting the results. We wanted to get some information. Do you have any additional questions that came to mind from this first recommendation? And it all kind of stems from the additional scenarios. Really, we don't know what the business as usual scenario is. What will the inevitable state of good repair investments in the electricity system cost? How does that compare to the decarbonization? That would be a first kind of scenario that would be really important to kind of recommend, because I was like, well, what are the system investments that we're going to have to make to 2050 anyway? And if anything can tell us on this one, it really does highlight it really does highlight from, let's say, example of the Whitby, what is the Whitby costing study, which looked at what it would cost Whitby to advance a net zero emissions within their buildings. And really what it came down to it is that, you know, people thought it was going to be very expensive to do that, but over the lifetime of the asset, the decarbonization scenario was actually more cost effective than the business as usual scenario. And the reason that it was able to be achieved is because they brought in their net zero plan into their asset management plan, and they had a scenario was like what was going to be the state of good repair associated with the assets just on its own, never mind the decarbonization. And then what is the decarbonization component? Everybody sort of thought it was going to need to be a premium that was saying, but when you look over the lifetime of the assets and the efficiency opportunities, it ended up being net positive for the Whitby's costing study. And just as a plug, if anyone's interested, we are going to be doing a little bit more of a deeper dive into the Whitby costing study. Thank you, Yule, yet again, you're coming to our rescue. And going to be digging a little bit into that. So just wanted to get some information on that. Perfect. Thank you. All right. Input on an integrated energy system analysis requirement. I'm going to throw that just if anyone has the, I'm going to throw that in the chat just in case anyone doesn't have the report opened up or anything like that. But I wanted to kind of highlight any additional input that is associated with this recommendation. And the reason I'm asking all of these questions is because we do want to get collective input into this. We're going to be developing a Clean Air Council submission that we didn't get in time because the ERO posting for the Pathways to Decarbonization was the 14th of May. And there's no way that we were able to kind of pull this all together on that one. We did take these recommendations and put them in through a Clean Air Partnership submission for it, but we are going to be submitting in a Clean Air Council one as well. And I really wanted to kind of get input on from the Clean Air Council network on the recommendations, seeing what we wanted, where we needed to dig a little bit more into providing information, the questions that came up, some of the things that we might need to dig into a little bit more. Ah, interesting. That's very interesting. I like that. Anybody, there's also, I wanted to keep in mind, there is no need for people to only put in their input via Menti. You're all, please do unmute. Just provide your input verbally.
Hi, Gabby. Supri here from the town of Whitby. How are you?
Hey there. Good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. I just wanted to add, especially with respect to the conservation and demand management plan. Previously, I think from 2015 to 2020, it was sort of an aggressive approach because I worked with a local distribution company at that time. And each LDC had a target of close to 7 terawatt hours that they had to achieve so that they bring in energy efficiency within their region. But if you look at the 2021 to 2024 framework that kind of came in after the current government stepped in, the overall target is, I think the overall they've achieved so far is 3.8 terawatt hours. So you can see the gap of, you know, them not pushing for these conservation plans, especially because it's the approach is like, oh, we did an LED lighting upgrade, so we are energy efficient. But, you know, we way past that. We're looking at heat pumps where, as you rightly mentioned, the municipalities are way ahead in pushing for a net zero strategy. So I just wanted to put it across there. They've actually started a new custom stream that came into force last week, where they are coming back, trying to get more energy efficiency within industries, the commercial customers and residents. So hopefully with a lot of municipalities looking for electrification, this would be a good opportunity for them to put in an application, because I think it's going to run only for a less amount of time, and they're going to scrap all of the lighting projects as well.
Okay. Thank you, super. I really appreciate that update.
No problem.
All right. And Mike, I think I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Gabby. Sorry, my video camera's not working. You have to look at my beautiful picture. But I just thought I'll kind of inform the Hive here that in Ottawa, we've started doing IESO IRP planning, and it is considering energy evolutions. So, our municipal climate plan as being a scenario, and they're open to. So I think it would be the first IRP plan that will do so. It's interesting that they, the first shot that the IESO seems to be doing at incorporating municipal plan is in a regional IRP plan, as opposed to say something like, the decarbonization pathways work. So I think it shows putting their toe in the water. Maybe not even their big toe yet, but that's about where they're at. So I think, Yule and Ralph, I think we'll have a sidebar about this coming up, because they're expecting Ottawa to kind of lead them a little bit about this. And I'll have some questions for you, but it's just interesting context on what's happening. So I thought I'd mention that.
Excellent, thank you. And out of curiosity, like I know, let's say, for example, and we'll dig a little bit into this. I'm going to go on to the next question, just as we're kind of considering this conversation. I just wanted to, but I did want to kind of get, if you had, like, has Hydro Ottawa, oh, sorry, I'm just the typing. Let's see. Okay, yeah, sorry. Just the, has Hydro Ottawa developed their own climate action plan that aligns with it? Is that something that's on Hydro Ottawa's radar?
So Hydro Ottawa, for their own operational emissions, they have a real moonshot project going, which is to be zero emission by 2030. And I mean, that is moonshot, because they're going to have heavy fleet vehicles that they'll have to have be zero emission. That is, however, that is not decarbonizing the community. That's
right.
They're helping with that, but that's not in any way kind of taking over that. And that's about where that stands.
Okay. All right. Because I know that and if there's any other municipalities, and we will dig into this other questions on that one, but it's also, while we're moving on to, going to hand it over to you, Scott, very shortly. But if you can provide any answers, and I think, let me just make sure that there's someone's typing away really, really fiendishly. And I can't figure out where it is. Okay, thanks. But one of the things I know that City of Toronto sent a request into Toronto Hydro for them to develop a climate action plan that would identify what does the utility need to do to help the municipality achieve its climate action plan targets. That's something that I think is really worthwhile as a kind of to-do moving forward for municipalities to engage with their local utilities and to advance that conversation on what needs to happen with the distribution system. But that's one opportunity, that's one effort that could take place in terms of many municipalities own their utilities and can provide that direction to their utility. So there's an opportunity there on that one. Oh, yes. And I will send it. Thanks, Russell. Scott, I'll turn it over to you. I see your hand is up. Take it away.
Thanks, Gabby, and thanks, Yul and Ralph. And I just had one question about the modeling. It's kind of specific, more technically related. In that graph showing all those municipalities and the total energy, and it was decreasing to 2050, that's energy on the heat pump side. When they're looking at total demand, I just have a question, and I'm unsure just in practice and what the kind of assumptions are built in, is when we go to heat pumps in that low temperature operation mode, when typically consulting engineers will design it for electric resistive heating, new builds, it's not as pronounced as retrofits on existing because they'll have tighter envelopes and have new BAS systems and be controlled very rigidly. But on retrofit buildings, it's a bit of an unknown to me. Is it the assumption going with natural gas backup heating for low temperature operation, or is it electric resistive on new heat pumps? Like, it's still hard to get away because the heat pump eventually becomes an electric resistive heater, even if you don't have those electric resistive coils.
So Scott, are you asking in terms of the assumptions that went into the methodology on the efficiency associated with air source heat pump installations?
Yeah, and I think yes, and it's specifically for retrofits of existing facilities. New buildings, I would assume, with certain municipalities going without natural gas connections on new buildings, you're not going to have natural gas backup heating. But for retrofits of existing facilities, for sure.
I'll leave it to Ralph and to Yule to answer that, but I don't think those level of details was transparent in what the assumptions and methodology. But I'm gonna, Ralph, Yule.
I can speak quickly to the climate action plan work that we presented, and that we did not look at hourly demand at the municipal scale. So none of those considerations have been assessed with respect to municipalities. In terms of the assumptions that IESO has applied on, we don't know what those assumptions are.
Okay.
As far as I know. Ralph,
Yeah.
would you add anything?
I think that with existing homes, the improvement of the efficiency and the retrofit of the buildings needs to be part of the overall strategy. And this is a beautiful example of how that would be outside of what the IESO would normally consider to be sort of the mandate or the scope of its analysis. But if we start putting heat pumps on buildings that are leaky, then it's going to be a problem on cold nights. If we can improve the efficiency of these buildings themselves, we solve that problem. When you combine it with the advances that are being made in the performance of these heat pumps at cold temperatures, I think we can look forward to a future in which we will be able to take our existing housing stock right off fossil fuels, which ought to be our objective. And there's enough anecdotal evidence now that this is possible, and again, it seems much more possible than some of the yet to be developed improved technologies on which so much is being bet in the scenario that's being put forward by the IESO, including future nuclear technologies, which have yet to prove themselves at all. So you see this asymmetry constantly. I know I'm deviating a little bit from your question, but it goes to a point that Gabby was making earlier, that over and over again, when it comes to things like advanced supply technologies, we put them in our scenario without a second thought to the fact that we haven't actually built these or proven how well they work yet. But when it comes to the demand side, where we already have evidence that we can take existing houses right off fossil fuels, we back away and we don't include it in the scenario. And as a result, we probably end up with peak demand projections in our forecasts that are higher than they need to be. Because the heat pumps stay pretty efficient down to -20. It's not that they lose their efficiency. They're still 200% efficiency at -20. But if the house is leaking heat, it's going to be hard for the heat pump to keep up. So let's plug the leaks.
And just think of the local economic and job creation opportunities associated with plugging those leaks. Like what an opportunity that presents for local economic development. I think that's another kind of area that really did kind of come out with the report. The economic, the co-benefits associated with reducing demand are local, that it's something your community can actually engage with, can benefit from. That big generation is very localized in terms of the benefits it provides to different communities, but the efficiency and demand reduction opportunity is something that every community can benefit from. And think about the job creation. I can't speak enough about that. So I think that, I know it's really hard. I know it's easier to rely on just produce more kilowatt hours. I know that the decentralization is probably really scary for a lot of the electricity planners who are ultimately on the hook if things don't go very well. But you know, like if there's, you know, this is that I understand and I feel for that. But ultimately, we have to get better about bringing all of our different inputs together into our energy system. All right, so I'm going to go on to the next one, input on climate change impacts recommendation. And one of the key questions that on that one is really coming in with sorry, I'm going to pull this one because I made some changes to this one. Oh, sorry, give me that one. I just made some to bring into some resilience aspects to that one. So I just wanted to get this one on. Just bear with me. Pulling it in to put into the chat. Okay. All of this input that you're receiving from folks is going to help us to finalize up this report. We are going to dig into some of the some of the outreach strategies, but I'd love to get your input also on outreach strategies as we're going into. So just really in terms of any recommendations on the climate change impacts recommendation, the impacts of climate change projections are transforming every aspect of society. These impacts need to be incorporated into projections of electricity demand, supply, and electricity system resilience. Perfect. Thank you. And someone was mentioning on the, let me just go back to some questions. We are going to go into, yes, we are going to be sharing this report with the IESO staff. Absolutely. We are going to be sharing that. I'll go into a little bit about some outreach strategies that I'd love to get some input from the group on. This is where collective brain power is so much better than sitting alone at your desk trying to figure it out on your own. Thank you for the laugh. Whoever put that in there. I appreciate that. Absolutely. Yes. Excellent. And you know what? I think that kind of sheltering in place kind of messaging is something that we need to also bringing into it. But ultimately what we come into this, like, we cannot do this electricity system planning in our silos. If we do, we will not be doing right by Ontario as a whole. Like, we can do better on our electricity planning than that. And I don't mean just electricity planning. I mean overall energy planning, because the two have to be brought together in order to enable us to do the decarbonization associated. If we look at our thermal systems and our fossil fuel systems along with our electricity systems as well. All right. So the next one, input on transparency recommendation. I am just going to, I'm sure a lot of people have input on that they'd like to provide on transparency. We are going to be doing, we are going to be asking for a freedom of information request to try and dig into it, but we really would love to kind of make this an ongoing conversation, and we will be engaging with the IESO to try and get that kind of conversation happening on increasing transparency. But the Freedom of Information Act is one of the ways that we would probably do that if we aren't able to get the information that we would need. But ultimately, the goal on this one is we really need to be improving on the transparency associated with our modeling reports. Oh, I should press enter. All right. There's, thank you. I hear you. All right. I'm going to throw in the next one. All right. I'm going to screen by here. Going through comprehensive economic analysis. If anyone has any additional comments on that one that I need, that would like to be added, some questions that might have come up, anything that kind of came to your brain when you were reviewing that recommendation. That's okay. No problem. All good. We're going to go to the next one. And I'm going to put in here on the stranded asset risk. We are going to be doing some research and reaching out to kind of understand who is looking at stranded asset risk related to the fossil fuel investments in the electricity system in particular. And we will be getting back to folks on how this is, or how this could be brought into the decision-making process, because thus far it has not been brought into the decision-making process or the modeling report studies as well. All right. And it's all good. Just gonna throw into the next one on accounting scenarios, if there's any input. Accounting scenarios, if there's any input on that one. Okay, that's good. All right. And last one on this one. Oops, I did it again. Give me 1 second. Share my screen, turned off again. And distribution system recommendations, if there are any. All right. All right, perfect. And last one, just wanted to, okay, I did want to kind of get a little bit of insight. Has your municipality engaged with your utility yet on how the utility and municipality need to work together to implement the climate action plan at the municipal level? Yes, yes, that's engagement is taking place. No, that engagement hasn't taken place thus far. Utility developing its climate action plan to support municipal climate action plan. A utility plan has been developed. The utility and municipality are working together on plan implementation. Just wanted to kind of get a little bit of a sense from where we are on the pathway between the municipality and utility engagement that needs to take place. Perfect. And then while just people are putting in this information, I'm just going to share a little bit of information. There is an outreach plan that we're developing for this report. From the input that we've received today, we're going to finalize the report, design it, and then it's going to go out into the wider world. It's going to be shared with the IESO, the Ontario Energy Board, the Minister of Energy, the Ministry of Energy as well. It's going to be there's going to be a Clean Air Council submission to the ERO posting. It will be a late ERO posting because the deadline was May 14th, but we're still going to get it in there. We want to advance this conversation with the ministry staff reviewing the ERO posting on the pathways to decarbonization. The report will actually be promoted to all your municipal council members as well. It will also be on the Ontario Climate Caucus agenda for June 21st. Yul and Ralph will be doing a presentation to the council members as on the report itself. We also think that it'd be great if the municipalities can share this report. I'm going to just kind of bring my slides over just to get this while that's going on. There is the we're seeking, hold on 1 second. So we're seeking that municipalities can share with their utilities. There can be opportunity to advance that discussion on the climate action plan and see what the utility has in place in terms of its distribution system needs, identification relating to the decarbonization within the community. There's going to be efforts towards an op-ed in newsletters, newspapers, I should say, not newsletters. Of course, we're going to try and get it into people's newsletters. And there's kind of recognition that we're going to be advancing a conversation to try and gather some of the questions in terms of transparency with the IESO and hoping to advance that conversation. There's also the option to get a freedom of information request, but also wanted to, based on all of that, I am going to ask if there are additional suggestions. Oops, I'm going to put this one here. We're going to skip that. We're going to go right on here. And we're going to be advancing this. I am just going to throw in some of the conversations on the what has been identified thus far as outreach efforts. Why is my chat not working? There it is. And just wanted to get a little bit more insight. Yeah, I do agree. Like the language is very intimidating a lot of the times with the energy system, and we do need to kind of again increase the literacy, but also reduce the the elite kind of perspective that, you know, this is something that only a small little set group of people can understand. All right, perfect. Oh, Mike, sorry. Okay, no problem. You can put it all in the chats as well. You can also email it to me at any time you want. All right. And so you can still kind of put these in. There's also a minimum as we're going to be doing it. Everyone here on the webinar, I'm going to just stop sharing this and stop sharing my screen so I can see people's faces as we kind of wrap this all up. Next steps on this one is the report will be finalized, designed, and then sent off into the wild world. We're going to be sharing again a bit more about the outreach efforts that we're going to be using. We're going to be collecting. I'd love to really be able to rely on this group of folks to kind of provide some additional insights on outreach opportunities. And then how do we advance this conversation? So this is the long the game. I understand that we don't have enough time on this one and that the decisions are being made really, really fast. And I don't have an answer for how we address that, but it does mean that we have to be advancing these conversations because there's some decisions that have long-term ramifications, and they not only from the perspective of the GHGs, it's going to add into the electricity system, but also from the perspective of how it sets us down a pathway of pushing towards supply without addressing the demand side and all the benefits that come from addressing and focusing in on the demand side and investing in the demand side. Because one thing that's very clear, and the achievable potential study was used to bring into the IESO pathways to decarbonization, but the price the achievable potential study is willing to pay for reducing demand is far, far lower than it ever is considering on supply. And that is a missed opportunity for Ontario. And if we lose that demand reduction opportunity, not only will increase prices in our electricity system, but it will also hamper our decarbonization efforts because of the heavy reliance the province has at present on fossil fuels for that meeting that electricity supply, and also for the local economic development and job creation opportunities that demand response plays. And if we lose those opportunities, we will be doing a poor energy planning job for Ontario, and we have to and we can do better on that one. So those are sort of the conversations that we're trying to facilitate happening across the province. And I really want to give a shout out to Ralph and Yule. This was not an easy effort to try and make sense of the IESO report, to kind of understand where the misalignments are between local action plans and provincial energy planning. This is a challenging, but I really want to give a shout out because it explained a lot for me, and I'm hoping it explains a lot for others. Other folks on the call as well. So we're going to be getting out that report to everybody. I'm going to be sending out the outreach strategy, going to asking more information on the outreach strategy. And I just want to give a big shout out to Ralph and Yule for helping to explain this in a very easy to understand format. So I thank you for that. I want to thank you all for your interest in this webinar and for this report itself. It's been really, really great to get a lot of your input. It was great to see the like the registrations. I was joking with Yul and Ralph saying that you guys, that they're at rock star status now in terms of the interest in this topic, but it just really goes to highlight the importance and the need and the interest across wider stakeholders on the electricity system and energy system planning in Ontario, and how we have to get a wider stakeholder base having these conversations, because our wisdom across those networks is going to help either achieve our decarbonization and electricity system efficiencies, or we're going to miss that opportunity and it's going to result in increased price on our electricity system. And that's going to make it harder to decarbonize. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. We know that we're starting down the process on this, and it's a long game on this one, but I really want to thank again Yul and Ralph for helping to advance that conversation, because it increased my literacy on the understanding of the issues, and I hope it increased all the folks on the webinars understanding of that and electricity system planning process. So thanks, Ralph. Anything you want to say at the end on the next steps, or anything that you wanted to add, Yul or Ralph?
Well, just to thank you, Gabby. You play such an important role in this province in bringing people together for these types of conversations, and the Clean Air Partnership more generally. So I'd like just to acknowledge how important a node in our network CAP is.
Thanks, Ralph. That's very sweet. Thank you. Made my day.
Echoed.
Thank you so much, Yul. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, everyone on the call. And I will be sending out a proceedings with this recording. Also when the final report is designed, and I'll also be sending enough follow-up to the proceedings on that as well. And I'll be letting you know about future outreach associated with this report as well. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Take care.